In the year 1573 BCE, Chamos, a young prince of Thebes, set his sights on revenge and glory in the cause of freedom for his Egypt, a land that had been held in thrall for about 100 years. Assembling about him the noblemen of southern Egypt, he told them of his plans for dealing with the Hyksos, the Asian oppressors who occupied the Nile Delta to the north. "I intend to fall on him and slit his belly. It is my desire to save Egypt and smite the Asiatic." The nobles murmured their protests. They were enjoying abundant crops and robust prosperity. The Hyksos even allowed them to graze their cattle around the papyrus marshes of the Delta region. But the Theban prince was resolute. "I am determined to battle the Asiatics," he said, "and the entire land will speak of me in Thebes as Chamos, the protector of Egypt." Chamos prevailed, and the armed forces of Upper Egypt sailed down the Nile against the enemy. The Hyksos were a motley collection of Semitic tribes that emerged out of the desert around 1700 BCE, and in the words of a later Egyptian priest, had savagely burned the cities, razed the temples of the gods to the ground, and treated the whole native population with the utmost cruelty. Perhaps the Hyksos had indeed dealt savagely with the Egyptians, yet these barbarians were also beguiled by the civilization they had conquered. After overrunning Memphis, the Egyptian capital near the head of the delta, the Hyksos established their own center of power at Avaris, in the delta's eastern frontier. From there, they exercised direct rule over the northern part of Egypt, while exacting tribute from the outlying rulers, including the restless princes of Thebes with their sun-bathed city some 600 miles south of the Nile's mouth. At the same time, the Hyksos took on Egyptian ways. They employed Egyptian administrators and tax collectors. They wrote in hieroglyphics. They worshipped Egyptian gods along with their own, and the rulers called themselves pharaohs. The conquerors even contributed to the proud culture that existed for millennia along the banks of the Nile. They introduced an upright loom that improved Egyptian weaving techniques, and they bequeathed the Egyptians such musical instruments as the long-necked lute, the lyre, the oboe, and the tambourine. Of far more interest to the Theban princes, however, were the weapons and other accoutrements of war that the Hyksos had wielded in their conquest. Chain armor, battle axes, long-range and high-velocity composite bows made of wood, animal tendons and horn, and, above all, the light, horse-drawn chariots that were the scourge of the era's battlefields. By the time that Chamos of Thebes moved against the Hyksos and their king, Apophis of Avaris, the Egyptians themselves had copied the deadly armory that once wrought their downfall. "I sailed downstream in might to repel the Asiatics," Chamos later exulted. "My valiant army before me like a fiery flame." A Hyksos vassal, commanding a force, confronted the prince at the town of Nefrusi, 160 miles north of Thebes. "Break of day," Chamos continued, "I was upon him like a hawk. By breakfast time I had driven him back, destroyed them all, and slain his people. My soldiers were like lions at their prey, carrying off their slaves, cattle, oils, and honey, and partitioning their property with joyful hearts." And on that triumphant note, Chamos' account of the campaign ended. He died, perhaps in battle, sometime before the fall of the heavily fortified Hyksos capital at Avaris. His young successor, Ahmose, concluded the long reign and eventually sent the Hyksos scurrying back into Palestine and Syria, their reign in Egypt over. Ahmose pursued, and the progress of his army, as it plodded across the burning sands of the Sinai, constituted for Egypt the dawn of a new and magnificent age. Bursting out of the geographic cocoon that always confined it, Egypt, in little more than a century, would build an empire that stretched some 2,000 miles in length. Through their control of crucial trade routes and from the tribute exacted in the lands they conquered, the Egyptians would achieve an opulence previously unknown to human civilization. Egypt would prosper under a woman who usurped the pharaonic crown and would survive the ruinous effects of a religious and cultural upheaval led by strange seemingly misshapen ruler. Under a succession of soldier kings who resurrected its imperial glory, Egypt would stand resplendent upon a summit of wealth and power, until at last decay set in, and a long, slow decline began. Ahmos's incursion was but the first tentative step along the road to empire. For 3 years the Egyptian king laid siege to Saruhan, a town in southern Palestine where the Hyksos leaders had taken refuge, and when it finally fell he withdrew from Asia. Ahmos died in 1546 BCE and was succeeded by Amenhotep I and then by Thutmose I. Although each in his turn renewed the campaigns in Asia, their expeditions were hesitant at best. The two successors were content to wrest whatever tribute they could from the small city-states along the route of the march, and to hold at bay the rising pretensions of the Mitanni, who had installed themselves in the watershed of the Euphrates River. After taking his place on the throne, Thutmose I proceeded to march through Syria to the upper Euphrates, where the Egyptians marveled at the peculiar behavior of a river that, unlike their own Nile, flowed from north to south instead of from south to north. To Thutmose and his army, the phenomenon was inverted water which flows downstream when really flowing upstream. When confronted by forces leagued with Mitanni, Thutmose defeated them soundly, and countless were the captives whom the king carried off in his victory. But despite the pharaoh's scribes proclaiming that the whole of the earth was under his 2 feet, the foray was in truth little more than a hit-and-run raid. Thutmose made no attempt to establish a permanent military or colonial presence in Asia, and hardly had his soldiers left the region than the Syrian princes stopped paying the tribute they had pledged.